Hello. Let me answer the most common question right away. I will not discuss the issue of the central bank's policy and interest rates because I am an economist. I deal with economics. And this is a question that today is decided exclusively in the political sphere. In it, it's not just that it's not an economic issue, there isn't a single economic aspect to it. This is purely a matter of power. Now let's move on to the second main topic, especially since it turned out to be a serious continuation. And this is specific, the Burevestnik missile. The thing is, as you can imagine, I'm not an expert in military affairs. I was very interested. What's the point of this missile that can fly for so long? When there's a ballistic missile, if you don't shoot it down at launch, then it's not clear at all what you can do about it. Basically, there's just nothing you can do. And it has only one drawback. Once it's launched, you can't stop it. In other words, the specifics of the Burevestnik are that it can fly for a long time. So yesterday I asked a prominent expert in disarmament, armaments, and political science who wished to remain anonymous what all this actually means. And he told me that from the perspective of the United States, the Burevestnik doesn't change anything. In other words, the issues that can be resolved by the United States can still be resolved. If the missiles are launched, then they're launched. There's no need for a missile that can circle around Washington, D.C. for a whole day, or around any other city, for that matter, no. Well, maybe there is, but for that, you'd really have to come up with some very exotic scenarios. But there is one country in the world that really loves to stage provocations using someone else's hands. Now, imagine that on the territory of Russia or Ukraine, there was a nuclear explosion or a powerful dirty bomb went off. And there's no straightforward interpretation right away. So here's the question. From the standpoint of doctrine, should you press the button? But then the missiles will launch, and there's no turning back. Or you could launch a couple of Burevestnik missiles, which would start flying around the area of the supposed culprit. And that could last about a day, maybe even longer, because we don't know the exact specs of this missile. During that time, you can figure things out. And if it suddenly turns out unexpectedly that the guilty party isn't who you thought, but someone else, then you can redirect the missile since you still have communication with it, or you can just sink it in the ocean. But if it turns out that those people really are to blame, even if it was by someone else's hands, well then, sorry, if you didn't hide, that's not our fault. That's the key point right there. Now, pay attention to what Trump, who is currently in Southeast Asia, said. He said, we're not playing games with Russia, and Russia isn't playing games with us. If we need to respond to some kind of Russian attack, we have submarines. So, I'm not really worried about the Burevestnik. They're working on military innovations, and so are we. Let me put it in plain Russian. You know, there's this great joke. It's about a hare, a boar, a fox, and a bear who sat down to play cards in the forest. And, naturally, before they start, the bear looks at everyone and says, all right, here are the rules. This is how we're going to play. And if anyone tries to cheat, we'll smack them in the face, right in that brazen, red muzzle. And what Trump said, that's exactly what it means. He understands perfectly well that the main threat posed by the Burevestnik is to London. Because right now, London is the only country in the world that can stage a nuclear provocation using someone else's hands, or something else on the same scale. That's what it means. And here's a very interesting point. The thing is, many people are already saying that Trump is not in shape, that he's sick, that he clearly, well, not sick in the sense of having some serious illness, but in the sense that the overall workload is so high that his body can't handle it. Well, by the way, this is actually a pretty typical situation. If you don't believe it, try scheduling yourself, say, 7 or 8 meetings in a day. Basically, plan them out so that, in theory, you could make it to all of them. But in practice, by around 3 o'clock, you'll find that meeting number 5 and meeting number 7 just naturally fall through. It just doesn't work, no matter what. That's pretty much the same situation Trump is in. He's got Russia, China, and now Southeast Asia, Venezuela, the Middle East, the UK, and the same goes for the EU and Ukraine. So just think about that. That's why I can totally understand that Trump might really have some problems here. And it's not an illness in the medical sense. It's just extreme exhaustion, plain and simple. All right, moving on. We're not going to get into the fact that Trump has a very particular team, that there's a lot he can't delegate, and so on, and so forth. And besides, he's definitely not our friend. But this whole thing, we don't play with them, they don't play with us, shows that he hasn't lost his sense of humor or his grasp of the situation. Because Trump described this picture absolutely adequately. This is really the main event of the past few days, and a very striking one at that. As for everything else, honestly, things are unfolding pretty much as they should. Problems related to the shutdown are starting in the United States of America. Because they need to pay money to food stamp recipients. The United States of America, several tens of millions of people receive government money for food. And, accordingly, on this note, by the way, this is in reference to the fact that there were ration coupons in the USSR. Yes, in the US, the system is much more high-tech, but the essence remains the same. Poor people need help. So, there's no money. I mean, you see, theoretically there's no problem. But the trouble is, the US government, like many others, can't borrow more because of the debt ceiling. And for this reason, it's a ridiculous situation. It's worth noting that in this sense, the US is a remarkable country. Nowhere else is there such a limit on national debt. Everywhere else, this is always handled in the budget law, but still. As for our country, we have a very interesting story that has nothing to do with monetary policy. Because the central bank keeps changing the indicators. Macroeconomic ones. Sometimes inflation is rising, sometimes. Other things are changing as well, and as a result, budget problems start to arise. Why? Because inflation directly affects the budget. Various types of social payments need to be indexed. So, if you said that inflation would not be 4% as the central bank promised when it raised the rate, but instead 6 to 7%, that means you need to index more, which means the spending side of the budget increases. And there's a similar story with the dollar exchange rate and all sorts of other things. So, here's the question. I remember the situation very well. Back in the 90s, when we tried to make the Ministry of Economy the main authority for the government's basic macroeconomic figures, not the Ministry of Finance, but, accordingly, the Ministry of Economy, we weren't allowed to do that, with the explanation that the Ministry of Finance is sacred. Now, as I understand it, the central bank has become the main authority after all. The government, with a straight face, handed over its most crucial point to the central bank. This honestly leaves me genuinely surprised from an administrative standpoint. How did this even happen? And by the way, at this point, nothing is stopping the State Duma from amending the law on the central bank. Specifically, in the part that says it shouldn't interfere with the government's indicators. I'm not at all trying to say that the government's numbers would be any better. But at the very least, there would be some separation. Because there has always been a bit of a conflict between the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Economy over who's in charge. And any conflict always allows things to be brought out into the open. The numbers, just like everything else, really. But if both the target setting and the execution of that target are in the same hands, it inevitably leads to all sorts of problems. By the way, the USSR had the exact same situation when the client, the Ministry of Defense, and the executor ended up being too close. For example, when Ustinov was made Minister of Defense, as well as Secretary of the Central Committee for the Defense Industry, that's when certain problems started to arise, because that competition disappeared. And competition is always a kind of driving force. That's why I strongly suggest that the State Duma, as part of the budget law review, adopt the proposal that macroeconomic indicators should be presented not by the central bank, but by the government. Or, at the very least. But honestly, that's complicated. It takes a long time. But the point is, the figures should be from the government. It's really just one line. You're not actually forbidding anyone from doing anything. The central bank can make its own figures. But the law should include the figures provided by the Ministry of Economy, which Rosstat reports to. So, consider this my legislative initiative. Of course, they won't do it, but still, our job is to crow, even if the sun doesn't rise. Thank you for your attention.